afternoon, everybody. Very happy to be back again at the Institute. Thank you very much, Jill, for the invitation to come. It's always a privilege and a pleasure to share a platform with Peter Fleischer, who's one of the acknowledged gurus in the world of privacy and technology, unquestioningly. As he says, we have regular contact because Google has its European headquarters in Dublin. As you can imagine, we have some full and frank discussions on privacy and data protection. We both have the difficult task of trying to get across to software engineers based on top of a mountain, or at least a place called Mountain View in California, that there is such a thing as European data protection law, that it's a fundamental right in Europe, and that there's these pesky commissioners who insist that actually it must be complied with, even if you are based on a mountain in California. So it's a challenging space for all of us. But I said we will continue to do our very best, including to relay back, as it were, to the European system, the international dimension, the difficulties of a company like Google to comply with multiple regulatory regimes, but on the other hand, to relay back to Google, this is a human right in Europe, it is the law, and everybody must comply with it, including Google. Now, as we all know, cloud computing is very much a hot topic at present in information processing and management, and there's an awful lot at stake. As Peter said, companies like his own have invested heavily in data centres. I'm glad to acknowledge that the Irish climate is for once a positive comparative advantage, that actually it's a good place to have a data centre. So in fact, I believe that even some of Google's competitors have data centres here. So, and as we note, the government only this week in its revised capital programme emphasised the importance of Ireland being a positive place for cloud computing. So I think there's a lot at stake also for us in Ireland to make cloud computing a success, to make sure that the environment is as accommodating as is compatible with the law. I stress that caveat. And I would suggest that even though cloud computing raises many of the challenges that Peter has mentioned, I would suggest data protection does no more than provide a necessary assurance to individuals that their personal data is safe in the cloud. And I certainly would hope that the type of changes he has mentioned that are planned at EU level and at international level should provide an updated framework to reinforce this message, and also to make sure that protection of data becomes easier to do for companies like Google. Now, you'll probably be surprised by this slide, but cloud computing has become such a catchy concept that it sometimes seems that almost any form of processing done outside the confines of your home PC is now classified as being in the cloud. So I propose to focus on the version of cloud computing which is important, I think, certainly for Ireland, which is the version of organisations outsourcing the processing of their data to a third-party cloud provider, such as Google. Now, when you look at this version of the cloud through data protection eyes, it looks very much like a variation on a very old model which has always been catered for by data protection law, which is the model of outsourcing processing of data to a data processor. Now, for those of my vintage, this used to be the normal model of computing. I suspect very few of you would have a recollection of punch cards operators, cards being sent off to be processed on a mainframe, and then the output hopefully coming back accurately in the form of printouts, your salary check, and so on. Both the software and the processing power were provided by the data processor, as in the cloud model. So I suggest that this version of the cloud does not seem to be conceptually very different from that very old model, a model around which EU and Irish data protection law was framed. What is different, however, is the scale of the processing and the corresponding risk to personal data. The key challenge for both the cloud provider and its customers is being able to guarantee the safety and security of the personal data in the cloud. And this is something Peter has referred to already in his talk. Now, a recent report by the EU body which is responsible for information security, it's called ENISA, pointed to the paradox that holding data in the cloud could both be a risk and a protection. As they point out, the massive concentration of data in the cloud is an invitation to attackers. But on the other hand, such concentration can provide the economies of scale that can justify expenditure on more robust security. So again, it's a question of dealing with this paradox in the cloud when you're considering data security in its broadest terms. The ENISA report also summarises the challenge to organisations considering outsourcing to the cloud. And we must remember the challenge isn't just one of compliance with data protection law. Especially for organisations that are heavily dependent on personal data, the potential cost savings in migrating to a cloud must be balanced against the loss of control of a vital corporate resource. I would, by the way, commend the ENISA report to anyone interested in a balanced assessment of data protection and other issues surrounding the cloud. The report had input from many people active in this sector, including from people active in companies like Google. So it does present matters in a balanced way, I suggest. So an organisation considering the cloud concept, I suggest that there are some hard questions they need to be asking themselves. Now, data protection law is crystal clear that, as ENISA puts it, you can outsource responsibility, but you can't outsource accountability. So outsourcing requires not only a written contract, but active measures to ensure data is secure in the cloud. Now, Peter mentioned the possibilities of cloud providers taking the trouble to certify to international standards. And certainly when we view a cloud provider, if we see somebody, or indeed any organisation, which has taken the trouble to certify to standards like ISO 27001 or SAS 70, that does suggest that that organisation is taking its security responsibilities seriously. But an organisation considering outsourcing will also want to get clear assurances on issues such as the robustness of access controls, the data backup systems, and the procedures in the event of data breaches. Now, particularly where an organisation is subject to sectoral regulatory restrictions, financial services would be a prime example, but also government services, obviously, the organisation may not be satisfied even to rely on third-party certification and may want to carry out some form of audit itself, while recognising, as Peter says, the type of audit that you would carry out on a cloud provider could be challenging, but it is possible. For cloud providers such as Google wishing to build a European customer base, there's no way of avoiding the separate security obligations imposed on data processors under EU data protection law. And I'm sure, as Peter would agree, neither would any responsible organisation wish to avoid those responsibilities. Now, Peter mentioned quite critically and understandably EU restrictions on international transfers, and with some justification one can say they are tedious and over-prescriptive. But I think we must recognise that the safety and security of data can be different depending on the legal regime of the country to which the data is transferred. Indeed, Google's own experience, particularly in Asia, illustrates this point. And indeed, as Peter pointed out, they have now very helpful tools where you can observe the degree to which governments do request access to data, or indeed how they restrict access in censorship terms. So the concept of protecting data, and in the case of Europe, it's because we consider at least that our data protection laws do provide a high level of protection to our citizens. There is a case for protecting that data when it does move outside our borders, but there is a serious issue as to the effectiveness of the current methods, and that certainly is something where I can share Peter's analysis and the importance of attempting to reach an international consensus on the rules that should apply to data internationally. But as Peter also knows, that is a major challenge, and we're unlikely to see rules that are universally accepted anytime soon. But for the moment, cloud providers that are willing to demonstrate in their contractual arrangements that they're open to accommodating these European requirements should have a comparative advantage in the European market. In conclusion, I suggest that cloud computing has a bright future in Ireland. As Peter says, we have a happy physical environment for data centres, and I hope the legal environment in general favours the cloud computing model. In the favourable legal environment, I would include an approach to data protection which focuses on the accountability of organisations rather than on bureaucratic prescriptions. As Peter says, I was glad to be associated with an effort to explore the concept of accountability for data controllers, a very useful exercise led by the Centre for Information Privacy in the US, and with the involvement of a number of my fellow regulators as well as international companies like Google. And I think the output from that exercise is going to be quite helpful in fleshing out the concept of what does it mean for an organisation to demonstrate, in fact, that it can be trusted with personal data. And I'm happy that the the relay has now been taken by our French colleagues, and there will be a second phase which explores further what accountability should mean for an organisation. I think we can also point to the fact that indications are that the revised EU data protection regime, which is meant to take account of technological developments such as cloud computing, will also move towards an accountability model which places greater reliance on the responsibility of organisations, but will also impose severe penalties on those who fail to demonstrate the necessary commitment to protecting personal data in the cloud. In conclusion, I think there is a wide degree of agreement on certain issues, such as, for example, the need for first of all, the need for data protection laws, the need for personal data to be protected, including when it moves to the cloud. I think there's also a wide degree of agreement that the current arrangements certainly make life quite difficult for international organisations such as Google, but just at least fundamentally the answer from any European regulator must be, that is our law, it is for you to comply with it. While we recognise your difficulties and will do our best to accommodate them insofar as we can, we are obliged to apply the law as it is. We will certainly try to take account of your concerns when negotiating a future EU data protection and privacy regime, but in the meantime, those are our laws. They're meant to protect our citizens, European citizens. They are still as valid as when they were drafted. They were drafted to be technology neutral, and as I hope as the illustration I showed demonstrates, that technology neutrality still applies even when you move data to the cloud. So I look forward to our question and answer session. I hope you found slightly contrasting presentations useful in terms of at least outlining the issues that arise in the cloud. Thank you very much.